Okay, so for this video we're going to go over how to work with independent motors. Um, so if we take a look at this robot, let me get a video going. So if we take a look at this robot, we have a motor here on the intake. We have two motors for these two shooters. We have a two motors there for our lifting mechanism. And we have another motor there that we're not going to use for now. So that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 motors. These motors back here are actually run with a PWM splitter. So we only, it's kind of like when we did the speed controller group, except for instead of doing that in code, we kind of did it in the real world with the PWM wires. So we actually have written down where all of the different PWM slots are for each of these. So luckily we don't have to tear it apart, and we just kind of know where they're at. So with that information, we are going to hopefully make all of these different systems work. We're going to start with this intake since it's out of the way and on its own, and we'll work our way through towards the back. So now coming back to our code, let's make sure we got a robot enabled. So in order to do this stuff, we're going to do all of it in periodic or in teleop periodic. So this is where our code is going to be written. Again, like I said at the beginning, since we're using the speed controllers, are actually vectors just like these are, so we don't need to add another import statement. But we do need to let it know that these motors are on the robot. So we're just going to say declaring independent, I can't spell, independent motors. So we're going to start with the intake first. So that is its own motor. So private final, and it's a Victor. So Victor SP, and we're just going to call it intake. We're going to call it intake motor. And then that's equal to a new Victor SP, and then the channel that it's plugged into, let me find it here, is number 8. So we are going to go ahead and run this off of an Xbox controller that we actually don't have in here either. So we are going to need to let the code know that we have an Xbox controller as well. So that's another joystick, and we're just going to name it m_xbox. Whoops, m_xbox is new joystick. And then this one is going to be plugged into slot 1. And if we look over here, it shows up. We don't actually have it plugged in, that's why it's grayed out, but that's where it's going to be in slot 1. So now that we have this intake motor here and that Xbox there, the code knows they exist, so now we can actually use them in our teleop. So we are going to just make a simple if statement, and we're going to say if a button is pressed, we want that intake motor to start spinning inwards. So we're going to use that Xbox. So then to get the buttons, it's this get raw button right here. And then to know which one that is, we come here, and I need to plug in the Xbox controller. So with the Xbox controller plugged in, we are going to go ahead and run that off of the, let's say, A button. So when I press the A button, if you look right here, these indexes start at 1. So since this is the first one, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way down, and then starts up here and then goes back down again. So this is going to be in number 1. So then if we put a 1 in here, so this is going to say if get raw button 1. So this is saying if the button on this Xbox controller is pressed. If the first button is pressed, then it's going to do what's in the body here. So then we want this intake motor to run. And the way you do that is just simply, we called it the intake motor up there. That's how it got its name. So we're setting, and we're just going to have it run at we'll just say 100% for right now, and we'll leave it at that. So else we want this to be set to 0, or you could just do stop motor as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and build and deploy that just to make sure everything works the way it should. Okay, so now that it's built, we are going to deploy it. So now that it is deployed, we are going to come back here, go ahead and enable the robot. So we're getting an error here saying that the joystick on port whatever isn't available. So that's because we don't actually have the joystick plugged in right now, which isn't a big deal because we're going to be using the Xbox controller anyway. So if you see when I press the A button, that motor then spins. And that's really all there is to making a singular motor run. So we are now going to disable this. Okay, so the intake motor worked, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the shooter motors. So something to think about is if we are going to intake the ball, it's going to need to go through our shooters and through the intake and then backwards through the shooters. So we're also going to need to be running the shooters backwards in here. So the shooter motors are actually done separately. They are also done with Victor SPs. So we're going to do this, and it's Victor SP, and we're just going to call it shooter 1 or shoot 1. And I'm not sure what channel that is, so I'm just going to leave it for now. Whoops. And then a shoot 2. Okay, so now if I go ahead and try to find what those were plugged into, according to the stuff that I have written down, they are plugged into 5 and 6. So if I do that and that, we now have our shooter motors. The program knows they exist, and we are then going to want to actually let them run in here. We're going to leave the intake part for now and just leave that. We're actually going to use our main joystick, and we're going to hit the thumb button on the joystick to control this part. So we're going to want to do get raw button, and then again, in order to get this button, we're going to want to plug in our joystick. Now that our joystick's plugged in, we can look here and then press this thumb button and see what it is. So it looks like that's going to be number 2. So then we can put in a 2 there. So now if that's pressed, essentially what we're going to want to do is, if that button's pressed and we want it to spin the motors out. Alright, hello there. I got interrupted last time, so we are going to pick up just about where we left off. I got to get the robot back over here quick. Okay, so before all of that happened, we had just finished this part right here. I'm saying that this stick, getting raw button 2, which is where your thumb would naturally sit. So we then wanted to take our motor and set them to just shoot at 100% power, essentially. Okay, and then we are also going to take another precaution up here. I'm not sure if this is necessary, but I think it will help for some other stuff. So if we press our button, it's going to go out 100%, otherwise it's not going to do anything. So then we also want these to go, when this is running, we want our shooter motors to be going inwards. So we'll just send this as like a negative 0.5, so it's the opposite as the other one. Okay, so now that we have that, let's make sure that we're connected. Build and deploy. Okay, so now that that build is done, we are going to deploy it. So now if I get a video going again, I can back this robot up. And if you look, when I press the thumb button here, the wheels are spinning outward. Let's see if I can get a close-up so we can... I don't know if the frame rate on here is going to show you or not, but they are both spinning outwards, which would then shoot the ball that way. So that also means that if we go ahead and plug in our other controller, and then press the button for that one, for the intake, whichever button we decided that was going to be. If we press that intake button, you can see that those go inward. So that intake's running a little bit faster than I think we want it to, so I'm going to slow that down as well. We are going to disable the robot. We'll set this to 0.8 for now. These are going to be running a little too slow, so we're going to go 0.7, whoops, 0.75, do 0.75 there, and those are running the same, or the right direction, so everything looks good there. So now the last thing that we need to do is our lifter motor. So give me 1 second, because I think we have air pressure in here. So if I get rid of our air pressure, and then I have a cylinder that I have to push out of place to allow our actual robot to do its thing, I had to release the air right here and then move back this cylinder that was pushed out. So now this is free to move up and down as we need it to, which of course that gets spooled up right there with those two motors in the back. So, as I said before, those two motors are using a splitter. So they actually act kind of as like the same motor, at least in code. So we're going to just name this one lifter. And I need to find out which channel this is plugged into. So it looks like the lifter is plugged into slot 9. With that in there, we can then come back down here and we'll program our lifter. So the way that we want to do this lifter is using the back triggers on the Xbox controller. So if we go back to our driver station, 2 and 3 are going to be the two axes we want to use. So now that we know what those are, we can go ahead and start writing our code. So we're going to use m_xbox, and we're going to want to get the raw axis, and then I believe it was 2 and 3. So we're going to do 3 for the right trigger. We'll do the right trigger first, and that's going to be to let it in. If we have that, then we're going to want to use our lifter.set, and we are going to want to set that to, we're actually going to use this value. Oh, I forgot to do something right here. So when we get this axis value, it's going to be equal to this value between 0 and 1 right here. This is 0 and this is 1. So we actually need to compare it so that way it can evaluate to like a true or false value. So we're going to go if it's over 0.2, just because that will help differentiate when it needs to be used and when it doesn't need to be used. So okay, so the lifter.set, we are going to set it equal to that actual value that we're getting for that Xbox. So essentially it's going to be the same thing as above. So that way, depending on how hard you're pressing that down, that's how fast this is going to run. So now for this other part, we're going to do the same similar thing. Gotta get raw axis 2 this time is greater than 0.2. And then we want to use our Xbox controller again. And then get raw axis 2. So something to keep in mind here is these are going to read essentially like similar values. They're both going to be between 0 and 1. So if we want this one to go backwards, we actually want to negate this axis value that we're going to be getting back. So everything looks good there. I'm going to build and deploy. Okay, now with that done, I realized I forgot one more thing. And that was to make sure that the lifter can actually be set, or it sets itself back to 0 if it's not being used by either controller. Otherwise, it'll just keep running and running and running and running. Build and deploy this again. Okay, and then let's try this again. So if I press the back trigger, or the right trigger, it goes up, and the other trigger goes down just as fast as I press it. And so that's essentially that. One thing I did notice is that my values are actually backwards. The triggers aren't how I want them to, so I'm going to switch around where this negative sign is. And I believe that's everything for all the independent motors. So that's all I have for this video, and I'm going to start the next one shortly.